All done for the recording? Okay, great. So hello everyone again. I think I saw most of you. People online, we are saying hello for later. um, so thank you very much for the invitation to Undip colleagues and also to Hawaii colleagues as well. Thank you very much for the invitation to share what we have been doing. So, so what I want to do today is to discuss a bit of a project that we are working at the moment with Undip, um, mostly about Semaran, but we will give a bit more of details on the project later today. But I thought that in order to do that, it would be good to have also some conceptual discussions and methodological discussions. So the key issue that I want to discuss, and I will explain later why, it's about gender issues. But of course, in order to discuss that, we also need to talk a bit more about resilience and planning. And since I understand that your course is about spatial planning, that could be also something that we require to discuss. Okay, so just very quickly, also because some people said to me, and even Ron said to me, you are not a normal planner, but I think that that depends also on how we understand planning in general and what planners do. My background is in sociology, housing, and then planning, but I mostly do social and political issues related to planning. I don't do physical issues about planning. So as we said earlier, I work at the University of Queensland in Australia. I'm originally from Argentina. And at the moment, I have a contract, or I work for two faculties, like because the planning program has recently been shifted or moved to a new faculty in our university. So now we have a new school that is called Architecture, Design and Planning. But we were before working in the school of what it used to be called environmental and earth sciences, earth and environmental sciences before, and before geography planning and environmental issues. So there have been lots of changes in the names, but now there is one school that works more on environmental issues and the other school that does architecture, design, and planning. And I have argued that this is a very arbitrary decision, a division that I disagree with, and that's why I'm in both schools. But I'm not sure if I will be able to continue having these joint appointments. So I also convene the programs. We have two programs, an undergraduate program in planning and a postgraduate program, a master degree in planning. And I teach three courses. So one that we mentioned earlier this morning, which is a joint studio with UGM on development complexities related to planning issues, mostly in Yogyakarta, another course on community planning, and a third course on global South cities and what are the development planning issues about the global South in particular. And the last figure there, or square or rectangular, that you see there is mostly what I want to discuss with you today, which is this collaborative program that we are working on with Undip, also with Semaran local government and Brisbane City Council in Brisbane, the city where we live in Queensland, in Australia. So the project is about technical and social and political and economic impacts of flood infrastructure in Semaran. And the reason why we are doing this project is because Brisbane and Semaran are sister cities. And they have been sister cities for 30 years or more, right? And even when you might think that the cities are very different, one is in Australia, one is in Indonesia, and they have social, political, economic issues that are very different. There are also lots of similarities. So for more than 2 years, we've been trying to discuss what are the similarities and what are the differences between the two cities. And I think it was the beginning of 2023, maybe some of you were able to join. We did a series of seminars between the four, like among the four institutions that we are discussing the issues between the two cities to do with flood mitigation, smart cities, smart city development, and housing and growth issues. Because again, we wanted to show that even when initially you might think that planning systems or the different aspects of a particular country or city are very different, you can also see that there are similarities. And more importantly, there are lots of things that we can learn from the other cities, which I think that for you here would be very useful in the sense of during these 2 weeks, trying to learn from other cities that might be discussed in the course. So, as I said, the main 3 points that I want to discuss is first, very quickly, a bit of a conceptual discussion, then some methodological issues that we are also discussing as part of the project, and then the project and some initial findings that we have in the project. So first of all, I thought that since you are discussing planning and spatial planning in particular, it would be useful to think a bit more about what planning is. And I think that we are here maybe 20 people and the people who will be listening online, and probably we have at least more than 10 different definitions of what planning is, of how we understand planning. So for me, planning is a process, and it's also an activity that is going to involve a very wide range of actors and institutions, and because of that, very different interests, and also very different motivations and objectives and expectations. So even when I agree that in planning, we have objectives, we have targets, which have something that we want to achieve, and at the end of the day, you want to show something like this is the plan or this is what we have done, it's very important to understand how the process goes. And this is the context in which we include this discussion on gender issues or JETC issues, as we are going to discuss later on. And also to understand that we very much need to understand that there is usually a perspective from the government or the public sector. We also have perspectives from the private sector. We also have perspectives from normal residents, citizens of those cities or urban areas that we are discussing. And those citizens, sometimes they have, apart from diverse interests, some people are more organized, some people are more active, some people are more proactive, some people are not. So how do we make sure that we trying to include everyone there? So the other point that is important for us is the concept of resilience. So, and very much we can see resilience as the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties. In our project, we are talking about disasters in particular and floods specifically for Samaran. So, and we know that because of climate change, we have more and more disasters, and they will become more regularly, and we will need to be more adaptable and more ready to respond to what the issues are that come up from the disasters. We also know that because 60% of us live in urban areas, now cities are considered as hotspot for disasters. Some people might call them urban disasters. The reality is that also it's very different how do you respond to a disaster in an urban area than in a rural area, because you have, first of all, different density. Second, you have different infrastructure and services, and also the way people think and the culture in urban and rural areas is very different. And the other aspect that we also need to consider is that, of course, there are different capacities that people have in order to respond to these disasters. And those capacities might be based or influenced by age, by gender, by socioeconomic status that we have, by different abilities. So we will be discussing that one issue that is included in JETC is people with particular disabilities. And this could be physical, mental disabilities, health disabilities, different type of disabilities. So how do we respond to those people and what are the needs from those people? And I think the other point that is very important is to understand that when we are talking about resilience, we are talking about both a collective and an individual process. So we as individuals might be more or less resilient to something, but at the same time, it's really important that we understand how we as a group, whether it's a community, a family, a group of students who are all living in the same place, they can respond to a particular event, in this case, a flood. So moving on, the other point that I thought that it was important, and I'm assuming that most of you are already familiar with the MDGs. Well, MDGs, maybe you were not born at the time of the MDGs. So the MDGs here on our left, let's say, were the goals that were developed initially with the new millennium in the year 2000. And originally, they were 8. And so countries that were part of the UN met and they decided if we are trying to achieve better development, higher development, human development that is improved, what do we need to look at? And they decided that these 8 that you see there were the key aspects that we had to look at. And of course, these goals had a particular point in time where the targets were to, and mostly it was 2015. For some goals, it was also 2020, but the majority was 2015. So later in 2015, they said, well, now we have arrived to our endpoint. What are we going to do? And they decided, well, it has worked well, even when there were lots of criticisms about the MDGs. We need to have these goals, and it's good to have something at an international level, even when we know that the complexities or the differences between different countries are very big. So each country has to have the opportunity to define their own targets and their own needs. But at the same time, they decided to expand not just 8, but now 17. The other point that it was very important in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, was that because the emphasis was so much on sustainability, resources became a central point. So before, you mostly had resources in goal number, oh, sorry. Sorry. So before we had the resources mostly in goal number 7 for the MDGs. It was all about sustainability, but later on it was unpacked in different goals. And so you have a goal for resources under the sea, above the sea. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm not going to use the point just in case. So, but you can see there, number 7 was, MDG 7 was about environmental sustainability, whereas here for the SDGs, we have a bigger range of goals that have to do with resources, right? So the other point that is very important is that in the SDGs, it was very clearly stated that this big objective of achieving higher human development, it's not just about countries that used to be called developing countries or countries in the global south, but it's the responsibility of everyone. Each country has a responsibility to play, and sometimes, and for different reasons, even countries in the global north has even a bigger responsibility to play in trying to achieve the SDGs. The other point that is important is that poverty is still the #1 priority, and we will be linking poverty later on with gender. Gender was a goal in the MDGs, goal #3, and it's still goal #5 as something really important that we need to look at when we are trying to achieve better, improved development. The other point is that, of course, you know that now we have an SDG that is SDG 11. So the urban areas become very important as an element that we need to look at. And there are differences when we are looking at cities than when we are looking at rural areas. And to me, the final point that is important in the SDGs is that suddenly there is one goal, #10, that is looking at inequalities. Why inequalities? Because we know that internationally, and especially before COVID, because things changed a lot after COVID or during COVID, many countries had made big progress in trying to address issues about poverty. And Indonesia is a very clear example of that, right? The poverty levels have been dramatically reduced. But at the same time, in particular, income inequality, but also wealth inequality, gender inequality are increasing. So the diversity, and in this case, the money that people earn is very different. How do we also address those differences? Okay, so moving on and knowing that we have a gender goal, how do we understand gender? What is gender? And what is the difference between gender and sex? Anyone who wants to guess some answers? Yes, please. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to repeat for the online people later on. So sex, the physiological, and gender, the social or sociological view. Perfect. Yeah. So we know that we have differences. Biologically speaking, we have differences between men and women. We also have, and increasingly, it's very important as part of a JETSI perspective to understand that for many people, they don't identify with this binary classification. Yeah. And they prefer to use different type of terminologies, whether it's intersex, unspecified sex, that has also to do with our perceptions, which is the second part of gender. So it's social relations, how we socially and culturally understand our roles in society, and whether it's about men and women, or whether it is as a third gender that is unspecified. And in some countries, this is very important. So how do we understand the social constructions around gender? And how do we understand that power plays a big role, culture plays a big role, social issues play a very big role when we are trying to address gender in particular? And how do we have lots of stereotypes that we are trying to address? And again, in different countries, things have moved very differently, right? Some countries are more progressive in terms of addressing gender, and they will be probably horrified by having this stereotype. In some other countries, they think that this is the case, and it should be fine that this is the case. So, and why is this important? Because when we are also looking at the city, we know that we have different needs in terms of gender, and we use the city very differently according to the gender that we identify with. So what is one very basic difference in terms of use of something in the city that we all use. Toilets, exactly. So what are the differences in terms of the use of toilets? Yeah, amount of paper consumed, time, water consumed. Yes. So usually you see public toilets, the queue for women is usually longer than the queue for men. The space that we need is different, right? So how, if you are interested in urban design, how do you address that difference? Yeah, some places address that better, some other places don't. And of course, there are other uses. There are other things that are very important in terms of gender differences in the city. What else? Taxis, transport, yes. And in relation to transport and taxis, what else? Safety, exactly. Yeah. So mostly women will feel more under threat in particular places in the city or maybe using public transport, even taxis, than men. So you also need to address those differences. So, and thinking more about concepts, something that is very important in our project about gender issues, it's the understanding of this role that is triple for women. So women have reproductive roles. They have to take care of kids, family, and the household. They also have a productive role. They need to provide money. They need to provide resources for their household. But at the same time, they usually have very strong roles at the community level. Most of these roles tend to be unpaid. And most of these roles tend to be at the lower level in terms of power structures. Here in Indonesia, it's more common to find a Pak Arte than a Bu Arte. Things have changed also, and it has become a bit more common, but still, it's very male dominated, those type of roles. Whereas the ones who do all the work within the community tend to be women, even if that is not recognized by a particular position or by a paid position, right? So because of that, we need to consider that there are different needs, as we said before, based on gender divisions. But those needs are very clearly divided in practical and strategic needs. Have you heard of these concepts before? Any of you? Some yes, some no, some no, some no. So very much what it means is that when we are looking at the practical needs, we are considering that, yes, because we have gender differences, we need different things. Toilets, right? So we need more time in the toilet, more time for women than for men, more toilet paper, as someone said, a different setting, perhaps, of the toilet, right? So, but addressing those practical needs are only a matter of satisfying diversity in a way. Yeah, it's not going to challenge more specific and more important issues to do with our relations, to do with who makes decisions. Those are strategic gender needs. For example, if more women are able to go to school, have better, higher levels of education, they might be able to get better jobs. They might be able to earn more money. Because they have higher incomes, they might be able to have more options to decisions made within the household than when they feel that they are passive because they are not earning any money and they are completely dependent on the decisions made by the husbands because they are the ones who make decisions and who make money. Yeah. So if you are able to address strategic needs, you are able to change differences that exist in terms of power between men and women. And of course, it's more difficult to address strategic needs. It's more even difficult to be able to identify what could be those strategic needs. Any questions so far? Yes.
You mentioned about the research done regarding those statistics, is that only pertaining to gender? Also, heterosexual.
Yeah. You can make it more diverse and you can make it more specific, of course. Yeah. And this is the interesting thing. So I think that in terms of planning issues, and again, this could be a really good conversation for later, in terms of understanding diversity, gender diversity. And so like here, for example, with Waria, it's something that becomes very important. So it's interesting to see how the discussion about gender is not just about men and women, it's also about how maybe transgender people have access to more decision-making opportunities. And so what would be the strategic needs for them or coming from them, yeah, to change things, to change power dynamics. The other point very quickly that I also wanted to mention is that we know that historically there has been a very strong connection between gender issues, in particular women development and poverty. And, like this has been addressed for many years and at very, very high level international conferences and so on, because the majority of the people who are poor are women. So this is very clear. And so how do we recognize the role of women and how do we make sure that they could have a better and higher development? And the point here is that it's not just about lack of income. It's not just that some women had to take responsibility of taking care of the kids or the household, and because of that, they cannot earn money. It's also about decision-making processes. It's also about access to education. It's also about cultural issues that might not allow a woman to be speaking in front of a man without asking for permission. And sometimes we think that this is something that might be happening in very remote rural areas or something very old-fashioned that doesn't happen anymore. We recently had a conversation with some students at UQ, and suddenly at least 6 international female students said, we are here studying because if we stay at home, we have to get married. And we don't want to get married yet. So for our families, the only option is we need to go and study something else. Otherwise, your normal duty would be to get married. So because of that, the issue is how do we put together or how we start thinking about all these complexities, but also all these different indicators that we need to consider when we are discussing gender issues. And of course, again, it's also not just about the income, but what is it that you can do or not do? What is it, the inputs that you might have because of your ability to participate more or less? And because of that, and some of you might know, there is now a very big research and very important trend in terms of understanding intersectionalities, which mostly have to do with gender, but they have to do with lots of different topics. Very much the intersectionality means that the accumulation of issues that are problematic or difficult to deal with means that it becomes more difficult to you. So if you are a woman who doesn't have money, who doesn't have access to education, you are accumulating lacks of deprivation issues, right? So your chances are going to become fewer and fewer. But also, it's not that this accumulation is a sort of sum of 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 4. No, it could become 10 because of the importance of the accumulation, if that makes sense. Yeah. So moving on into the JETSI discussion for us, we know that at the moment, there is a very big trend about gender, and in particular, JETC. Some of you might have heard about this acronym before. So it means gender equality, disability, and social inclusion. And in most projects funded by international organizations, they all require to have some JETC discussion, right? So you can use it as a part of your analytical lens, like your framework. How do you see things according to JETC indicators? And very much the aim is to try to understand and provide a response to the different needs of people. We mentioned already the differences between needs between men and women, but we can also, as you were talking about, define different needs according to sexual orientation or capacities. People with different disabilities, what are the capacities? What are the needs they have? And when we are talking in particular about gender mainstreaming, because again, JETC still is, even when we know that it includes social inclusion and disabilities, people still focus a lot on gender more than the other aspects of the JETC discussion. But we know that the gender mainstreaming discussion has also been a long discussion for more than 2 or 3 decades. And again, you could be discussing whether we need to understand JETC as something that goes across everything that you do, like, you know, like you work on housing and gender, water and gender, design and gender, planning and gender, or you want to have a ministry for gender, a department for gender, and goes vertically. So that's a very interesting discussion that happens in many countries in terms of how do you address gender, how do you include gender. And because of that, we have had for many years 2 very big approaches in terms of policy responses to gender. The first one, the Women in Development, it's very much talking about the approach is based on the practical needs. So it's very much understanding that, yes, men and women are different and they have different needs. And we need to try to integrate, we need to try to identify the needs of women, which before were not really recognized, right? So the first approach is very much saying, we need to understand women, we need to include women. Whereas the second approach, the gender and development, it's seen as more progressive. It's seen as an approach that is trying to understand the strategic needs, not only understanding that we are different and we have different needs, which are practical needs, but we also have strategic needs. If women have more access to same payments for same positions in any type of jobs, the discussion will be very different. So it's not only the inclusion, but it's also the equity discussion, which of course is going to, at the end of the day, provide more opportunities for empowerment for a group that still tends to be marginalized to become able to have the same opportunities. Okay, so now moving on to our discussions. So in this project that I mentioned earlier, we have discussions on JETC frameworks and how we want to integrate. So this was at the beginning of the year. And so part of our discussions were like, well, on the one hand, we know that different organizations have lots of different frameworks. So if you are working for UNDP, you have a JETC framework. If you are working for the World Bank, you have a JETC framework. If you are working for DFAT, which is the Australian agency for development, you have a JETC framework. Our funding body, which we will mention in the next slide, has also a framework. So different organizations have different frameworks. Some of the indicators in the frameworks are similar, others might not be similar, right? So that was part of our conversation. How do we address that diversity? And so one thing that we did in this project was to interview some people who we consider JETC experts people who have been working on Jet Sea issues for a long time, on development projects in Indonesia and in Australia. So we interview them and we ask them, what do you think? What do you think are the key issues that we should be looking at in our project? And what are the things that you have been, looking at in your own projects? And what have been like the opportunities, but also the problems or the difficulties or the obstacles that you have had. And we are still working on the analysis of this. It's not a very easy thing to analyze. But so what we have done, I will go first to this before I. So, okay, so this is our project. So it's funded by ConnectC, which is very much a scheme, a research scheme funded by the Australian government, by DFAT, and is trying to promote partnerships of knowledge co-production between Australian and Indonesian organizations. This could be universities, local governments, NGOs, different organizations. So you can see our faces. So from the universities, from UQ, it's myself and Ron. From Undip is Budona, Buwiwi. We also have 4 or 5 research assistants. We also have, as I mentioned earlier, the contributions from the 2 local governments, because at the end also the project aims to provide policy recommendations that are going to be co-produced by all of us and by all the participants in the project. So as I mentioned earlier, the project is trying to understand the impacts that different type of infrastructure, in particular for flood mitigation, built here in Samaran, have had for the populations who live around those infrastructure projects. So we have 4 case studies, and these case studies have different type of infrastructure. So one is a dam, the other one is the normalization of a river. We also have a polder, and the idea, so it's 2 different rivers and the polder and the dam, so 4 different projects. And of course, the communities are very different as well. So we have done focus groups, interviews, discussions, visits, and we are trying now to start the conversation about how do we start analyzing the data, but also what are the gaps that we still need to address. So some of the Jet Sea indicators that we have come up with, and they were helping us to address during the focus groups, had to do with access to information, information about the construction of the particular projects that we were discussing, or information after the projects, so differences between men and women, participation also in the decision-making process of why are they going to be building a particular dam next to your house? To what extent you were able to provide any comments or not. We also discussed issues about daily activities, current daily activities, and the change before and after the building of the infrastructure. We also are trying to address issues about what are the impacts for disabled population that might be living in the communities that we are looking at. And this could be physical or mental disabilities. And we are also trying to understand if there are differences in terms of socioeconomic status. And we link this with the discussion about social inclusion or exclusion. So to what extent people that might be the poorest in the communities might be also feel marginalized or not very much included in decision-making processes. And we also wanted to have a look at age differences, because of course, first of all, there are people that based on age have been living in a particular place for longer periods of times, but also we also understand that climate change issues are very different when you discuss the problems with young people or people who are a bit older. And still very much in progress, and we can have some conversations, but we are at the very initial part of the analysis. Some of the ideas that we have been discussing have to do with, of course, still the productive activities. So whether the communities around these projects are still farming communities or communities that live out of fishing or communities that mostly work as construction workers, for example. So mostly the productive activities are still done by men. There are many women who stay at home taking care of the kids. So you still see that very distinctive division between reproductive and productive roles. At the same time, it seems that women have had less opportunities to participate in any decision-making processes, in any information sessions, in any socialization situations than men. And also some men have had not a lot of or not many opportunities for discussion, in particular when the construction of some of these projects were discussed. And at the same time, we know that some of the changes that the communities have gone through and the improvements, and in particular, some communities have improved their living conditions, but mostly these changes address practical needs of women. They don't really look at the strategic needs, for example. It's very limited still the impact that we see in terms of women getting more resources for themselves or women having the opportunities to spend less time cleaning the house before because it got flooded and now going to school or now, developing a new job opportunity for them that they have more time. So we still don't know that, but again, this is very much work in progress. So it's not final findings. We still have a few months to go and more data to be collected. And so, yeah, so this is the project team. And I wanted to say thank you to the team members, in particular to the research assistants and Ida in particular, who have been collecting data, a lot of data for a few months, but also from us to you, because we are sharing this project with you. And thank you very much. Do you want to come now and we do the questions later? One hour. No, you don't have an hour. 1 hour.
Okay, mine will be the very